August 20th, 1947. Courtroom 600, Palace of Justice, Nuremberg. 7 men rise in the dock, faces pale under the harsh lights. They adjust their ties, glance at families in the gallery, professors, surgeons, Luftwaffe consultants, respected names in German medicine. Moments from now, judges pronounce death by hanging for each. But across the room sits Herta Oberhäuser, the only woman among the 23 defendants in this medical trial. She faces the same charges of war crimes, crimes against humanity, her role tied to the same horrors. Yet judges spare her the noose, sentencing prison instead. Here's what you need to grasp right away. These men mounted fierce defenses. Superior orders, wartime duty, scientific advance. Oberhäuser did too. Prosecutors laid out identical evidence streams. Judges weighed it all. What tipped the scales so 7 men die while 1 woman walks from execution? This video uncovers that fracture point, the legal moral calculus that hanged doctors but freed a nurse turned camp physician. Stay close, because by the end, you'll see exactly why her survival reshaped views on guilt, gender, and justice in atrocity trials. The core riddle drives everything. Why death for the 7 architects of Nazi medical terror? Life for Oberhäuser in the Ravensbrück orbit? Prosecutors painted doctors as eager killers, twisting healing into extermination science. Defenses countered with necessity, obedience, minimal personal fault. For her, arguments stressed subordinate status, lesser direct kills, a woman's perceived lesser menace. Judges parsed degrees. Initiative versus compliance, command over execution, zeal beyond orders. This wasn't raw sexism, though gender-shadowed perceptions. It forged precedents in individual culpability, medical oaths under tyranny where mercy meets retribution. You'll learn the 7 hanged: Karl Brandt, Waldemar Hoven, Joachim Rogowski, Wolfram Sievers, Victor Brack, Rudolf Brandt, and Karl Gebhardt. Their crimes sealed fates. Oberhäuser's path diverged on evidence nuance and courtroom optics. This shapes today's tribunals, ethics codes, debates on who merits the gallows in systemic evil. Before we rewind, if deep dives into Debüt war crimes, Nuremberg's legal battles, and ethical fractures from Nazi medicine grab you, using trial records, affidavits, judge opinions, smash subscribe now. It fuels these breakdowns. And hit comments. Was sparing Oberhäuser true justice, or did gender blind the court to equal guilt? I scan every reply, curious on your take. Let's plunge in. May 1945. Soviet troops storm Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp north of Berlin. Barbed wire sags, guards flee. They uncover 40, Zeros utter souls in torment, mass graves half dug, operating theaters stained with blood. Amid chaos, Red Army medics seize ledgers, patient cards, surgical logs, Nazi precision paperwork amid genocide. No hasty burnings here. Perpetrators archived their atrocities, convinced of legitimacy. These files spotlight Ravensbrück experiments, bone muscle transplants, deliberate infections, sulfanilamide tests on gangrenous wounds. Prosecutors later dub it a human slaughterhouse. Here's the pivot. American-led teams in Nuremberg collate this with Dachau, Buchenwald halls. By late 1945, patterns emerge. Not rogue sadism, but coordinated medico-military machine. 7 male doctors emerge as linchpins. Karl Brandt, Hitler's surgeon. Wilhelm Beigelbuck, seawater starvation tester. One by one, their signatures litter approvals, reports, orders. Enter Herta Oberhäuser, 32-year-old MD, only female. Assigned 1942 as Ravensbrück chief surgeon. Not designer, but executor, selecting victims, overseeing ops, injecting bacteria. Why her? SS needed reliable female staff for all-women camp. She volunteered, drawn by career boost in Himmler's orbit. Let me lay out the Ravensbrück horrors that bound them. From July 1942, Professor Karl Gebhardt, unindicted but central, orchestrates scientific surgeries on Polish women. Rabbits, they call them. Gebhardt tests bone grafts for war-wounded troops, but methodically. Shatter legs, sans, anesthesia, transplant infected bone, sew wounds to fester. Parallel. Sulfanilamide trials. Infect leg gashes with streptococci, clostridium, gas gangrene mimics. Pump sulfa drugs, track failure as sepsis devours. Victims scream weeks, limbs amputated crude. Oberhäuser logs it, selects 74 Poles, 12 Russians, injects pus from camp sores, monitors fever spikes, tissue rot. One log details patient 15, 22-year-old, thigh gashed, bacteria sown, sulfa futile, amputation day 14, death day 28 from shock. Photos capture yellow pus, blackened flesh, clinical trophies. Male doctors link in, Hanloser, Wehrmacht medical inspector, green lights protocols. Mrgowski, SS hygiene chief, supplies bacteria cultures. Sievers, Anna boss, coordinates data flow to Berlin. Their memos praise valuable results, request more subjects. Documentation damns. typed reports to Himmler, graphs of infection curves, autopsy slices preserved in jars. Why this evidence crushes defenses? Nazis filed like grant proposals. Gebhardt to Himmler. Experiments advance military surgery. No secrecy. They photographed, tabulated, presented at 1943 consultations. Allies capture it pristine. Exhibit 240, Protonotary details Oberheiser's selections. Russian autopsy protocols tally 86 Ravensbrück experiment deaths. Prosecutors spotlight one thread, sulfanilamide on live infections. Ethical research demands consent, risk halt, oversight. Here, prisoners, politicals no recourse, walk to block 10 believing delousing, emerge mutilated. Oberheiser injects personally, notes good pus yield from foot ulcers. Gebhardt's team transplants her treated bone grafts. 7 men authorized expansions, chase promotions. She executed under them. Legal hook. All violate Common Article 3 humanity standards. Pre-Geneva baseline. Ethically, Hippocrates dies. Harm is protocol. Fast forward to indictment. August 1946. U.S. versus Karl Brandt et al. Doctor's trial. Nuremberg. Subsequent. November 1. 23 charged. 20 physicians. 3 admins. Counts. 1 to 3 war crimes, crimes against humanity via experiments. 4 euthanasia murders. Ravensbrück. Central, 5 defendants directly tied. Oberheiser, Beigelbuck, linked peripherally, plus overseers like Handloser. Chief Prosecutor Telford Taylor deploys blitz. Documents first, survivors seal. Strategy, prove not harsh necessity, but sadistic pseudoscience. Defense playbook mirrors man Nuremberg. Superior orders, military utility, no direct hands dirty. And for males, Handloser claims inspector only, no ops oversight. Sievers, admin, science curator. Prosecutors counter, signatures approve prisoner quotas, data laundered as legit. Oberheiser's line, nurse aide initially, then MD under Gebhardt. No initiative, followed verbal orders. Her counsel paints subordinate woman, less culpable architect. Trial opens December 9th, 1946. Wood-paneled room hums. Stenos clack, translators murmur. Defendants in suits, Oberheiser in plain dress, hair neat. Taylor opens. Medicine unshackled from ethics becomes state murder tool. First week, paper avalanche. No 941. Oberheiser's own affidavit admits injecting 5 to 6 prisoners daily, overseeing 150 plus ops. Photos flash. Victims' legs ballooned green-black. Judges, Beals, Vorkink, Christensen, flip pages, faces granite. Prosecution threads, males to apex. Brandt coordinates euthanasia feeding experiments. Schroeder chairs OKW committee rubber stamping camps. Rostock, Berlin prof, lectures on transplant progress. All new Ravensbrück via circulars, conferences. Here's Taylor's genius. Frame as conspiracy. Not lone wolves, but pyramid. 7 at peak initiate, sustain. Oberheiser, mid-tier performer. Defenses fire back. Take Handloser. Counsel argues. Wehrmacht docs demand rapid wound healing research. Sulfa tests fulfill. Troops die of gangrene. This saves. Prosecutors dismantle. Show Allied sulfa trials on volunteers. Ethical bounds. Exhibit 191, U.S. Army Manual. Consent mandatory. Immersion max. 30 I'm in simulated. Ravensbrück? Weeks of agony. No pullout. Orders crumbles too. Sievers letters volunteer on Inerba for vital tasks. Murgowski cultures typhus for Auschwitz, beyond duty. Oberheiser fares better optics, admits acts, blames Gebhardt. He ordered, I assisted. No letters from her chasing glory, no lectures boasting yields. Gender whispers, woman doctor rare, nurturer trope. Judges note her testimony composure, but evidence damns minimally. Fewer autopsies claimed, less chain command. Turning point testimony seals male's doom, cracks hers open. January 1947, Wanda Poltawska, Polish survivor Block 10, takes stand. Atmosphere thickens, gallery hushes. Slight, scarred, she recounts. Oberheiser chooses us. 70 girls strong, says special duty. Strips, gashes, thighs glass, deep to bone. Fills with gangrene from dying men's legs. Details vivify. Oberheiser grinds bacteria and sews loose. Pus erupts days later. She watches daily, probes wounds, laughs, good progress. Poltawska names ops. Bone-shaved femur, inserted shin. Walks lamed forever. Court gasps at scars shown, but pivot. Cross-exam softens on Oberheiser. Followed Gebhardt, not Chief Cutter. Contrast Dr. Fritz Fischer, male witness. Admits dissecting live Ravensbrück victims for Gebhardt. Data to Sievers. Judges scribble. Initiative proven for men. Oberheiser, present, not proposer. Atmosphere shifts. Males as eager, her compliant. Legal gears grind now. Tribunal crafts novel law. Individual responsibility trumps hierarchy. Superior orders not defense from main Nuremberg evolves. Here, enthusiasm voids it. Degrees matter. Planners, executors die. Aides in prison. 7 cross irredeemable. Karl Brandt kills the disabled via T4 and extends that logic into camp experiments. Waldemar Hoven turns Buchenwald's infirmary into a killing ward with phenol injections. Joachim Mrugowski uses typhus and phenol as tools of mass murder. Wolfram Sievers runs the Ahnenerbe as a crimes hub, from Jewish skeleton collections to Ravensbrück data. Victor Brack and Rudolf Brandt provide the logistical and administrative backbone for euthanasia and camp research. And Karl Gebhardt designs the Ravensbrück bone and sulfonamide horrors that maim and kill the rabbits. Their initiative, memos, speeches, shows fanatical zeal. Oberhäuser, active participant but no approvals penned, no expansions sought. Judges weigh gender implicitly. Her role, auxiliary, less command aura. Precedent births. Nuremberg principles extend to medics, personal agency key. Ethics seed, consent absolute, experiments therapeutic only. Her spare tests, vicarious liability bounds. Complicity punished, not capitally if subordinate. August 20th, 1947, verdict dawn. Courtroom swells, press scribbles, survivors clutch rails. Judge Beals intones, tribunal finds overwhelming evidence of deliberate, ruthless experiments. Systematic takedown. Defenses fail utterly. Males indicted. A primary responsibility undeniable. These accused, conceived, directed with cold calculation. Brandt, euthanasia architect, experiments extension. Sievers, Ahnenerbe crimes hub. Language escalates. Ruthless disregard life, treating humans vermin. Death decreed. Necessary retribution. Exemplary deterrent. Oberhäuser. Guilty all counts. Selected victims. Performed ops. Injected infections. But no evidence superior planning role. Acted under Gebhardt. Life imprisonment. No. 20 years. Later cut. Contrast stark. Men irreclaimable. She degree lesser. Gallery murmurs. Justice or chivalry? Aftermath chills. June 2nd, 1948, Landsberg. Gallows Creek midnight. Brandt first. For Führer, pure conscience. Trap drops. Handlows are stoic. Mrugowski prays. 7 swing. Ironic clinic. Necks snap efficient like their incisions. Bodies carded dawn. Oberhäuser serves 5 years. Freed 1952. Political clemency. Practices medicine briefly. Barred 1958. West German court. Patients flee recognition. Dies in 1978. Obscurity. Unrepentant. War duties. Legacy splits. Males symbolize medico-fascism. Her survival fuels women spared myth, though evidence nuanced. Fracture endures. Doctor's trial spawns code. 10 rules. Consent voluntary. Avoid needless suffering. Shapes Helsinki IRBs. Your vaccine trials bow to it. But Oberhäuser haunts. Gender bias. 1940s. Courts view women lesser agents. Followers. Modern lens. Equal guilt. Execution fair. Tribunals evolve. Yugoslavia. Rwanda hang women too. Ethically, her acts match. Victims name her butcher. Legacy probes. Gradations vital or all enablers equal. Capital for apex only. Reflect. 7 hanged for apex zeal. Oberhäuser spared as cog. Justice calibrated culpability. Birthed ethics guarding billions. Yet questions linger. Mercy weakness. Gender taint. Comments. Should Oberhäuser hang too? The prison clock at Landsberg strikes midnight again in memory, but this time, stay in that courtroom a little longer before the gallows. The decisive moment is not the drop of the trapdoor. It is the quiet, controlled reading of a few pages that separate 7 men from 1 woman. The judges sit elevated, black robes framing solemn faces. On the defendant's bench, the 7 future condemned lean forward, staring straight ahead. Herta Oberhäuser sits slightly apart, hands clenched around a folded handkerchief. The clerk passes up a sheaf of typed pages. The presiding judge begins to speak, not as an avenger, but as an architect of a new legal order. Here's what you need to understand about this moment. The tribunal is writing more than sentences. It is drawing lines, who crosses into beyond forgiveness, and who, though guilty, remains inside the boundary where law can still choose life over death. The judges have spent months categorizing evidence in their minds. Who conceived experiments, who approved them, who supplied victims, who wielded scalpels and needles. The 7 men are at the top of multiple chains. Karl Brandt at the apex of euthanasia and experimental policy. Wolfram Sievers at the hub of SS research. Mrugowski directing lethal typhus and phenol injections. Others binding Wehrmacht medicine to the camp system. Oberhäuser occupies a different slot. The only woman doctor to stand here, a camp physician who cut and injected, but who never signed a single policy document. The law now has to decide whether that distinction is cosmetic or morally decisive. The judgment on Ravensbrück is where her case and theirs intersect most sharply. The tribunal describes in plain language what the bone muscle transplantation and sulfanilamide trials really were. Prisoners, overwhelmingly young Polish women, were selected precisely because they were politically suspect and expendable. Their legs were deliberately mutilated, inoculated with virulent bacteria, foreign material inserted to provoke infection. Operations were conducted without any therapeutic purpose. Some surgeries recreated battlefield injuries. Others had no plausible clinical relevance at all. Several patients died. Many were left crippled. All suffered agonizing pain. Every step, selection, incision, infection, aftercare was recorded in German, signed by SS doctors, photographed, and reported to superiors. The judges point out the crucial legal fact. None of the procedures were necessary to treat any existing medical condition. They existed purely to generate data, with death and disability accepted in advance as part of the design. The tribunal then turns to the defendants tied to these experiments. For the male leadership figures, the language is ruthless. The judges spell out how Gebhardt, though tried separately by the Poles, relied on an entire network. Siever's Ahnenerbe office, Rogowski's Hygiene Institute, Hanloser's oversight of army medicine, Brandt's role as the Führer's plenipotentiary for health. Their responsibility is described as primary and directing. They requested camps for research, channeled funds, allocated prisoners, and used results to bolster their rank and reputation. Their guilt is not only in what they did, but in what they planned and initiated. They turned entire institutions into instruments of murder cloaked in research, and that makes their crimes, in the eyes of the judges, deserving of the ultimate penalty. Then the judgment reaches the name Herta Oberhäuser. The tone changes, not to exoneration, but to calibration. The tribunal finds that she served as a camp physician at Ravensbrück, participated in the experiments, and personally carried out operations and injections on unwilling prisoners. Witnesses testified that she selected women for procedures, administered anesthetics in grossly inadequate fashion, and in some cases gave lethal oil and poison injections to those deemed unfit to survive. The court describes her as having shown a cruel disregard for the suffering of her patients. Legally, she's convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. But then the judges note something they do not say about the 7 men. She did not design the experimental program. She did not occupy a high policy-making rank. She acted under the immediate direction of Gebhardt and Fischer, who conceived and led the operations. Stay with this distinction because it is the hinge of the whole story. The tribunal is not saying just following orders absolves her. If that were true, she would have been acquitted. Instead, they treat her as an example of a lower-tier participant whose guilt, while real, falls short of warranting death. The judges know they are setting precedent for thousands of future cases. Officers, civil servants, nurses, junior doctors in any regime of terror. If every person who obeys criminal orders in such systems automatically qualifies for the gallows, the law becomes indistinguishable from vengeance. If only those who write the orders are punished, the law lets too many human hands clean of blood walk free. The sentence they choose for Oberhäuser, years in prison rather than a rope, marks their attempt to carve out a middle ground of serious but non-capital culpability. Ward and the defense arguments for the men and for Oberhäuser expose the contrast even further. For the 7 male doctors, counsel leans hard on technicalities and professional status. They insist the experiments were no worse than risky treatments used by Allied doctors in emergencies. They emphasize academic titles, international publications, conference presentations. The defense tries to recast them as pioneers who simply pushed too far under wartime pressure. The judges are not convinced. The meticulous paper trail shows deliberate, repeated choices to inflict non-therapeutic harm. Internal correspondence shows them lobbying for projects, asking for more subjects, even framing promising results in terms of career opportunity. The tribunal concludes that these men did not reluctantly drift into evil. They drove it. By contrast, the defense speaks of Oberhäuser as an implementer. They point to her relatively junior age, early 30s during the worst of the Ravensbrück surgeries, her subordinate rank, and the overwhelmingly male SS hierarchy around her. Her counsel emphasizes that she was not invited to the major planning conferences and held no authority over camp-wide policy. They also stress something uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. In a Nazi worldview that defined women as supporters rather than leaders, she would never have been allowed to initiate such projects on her own. The judges cannot and do not accept this as a shield from guilt, but they accept it as an explanation of role and scope. Again, the idea is not that a woman is less morally capable. It is that this particular defendant's provable authority and initiative were quantitatively different from those of the male planners in the dock. One of the most devastating sequences in the courtroom comes during survivor testimony about Oberhäuser herself. Several Polish women describe her presence during operations, her hands in their bodies, her needle at their arms. One recalls Oberhäuser injecting a clear liquid that induced agonizing cramps, then death. Another describes receiving oil injections to relieve pain, only to spiral into respiratory failure. These stories make clear that she is no bystander. The tribunal references them explicitly in its written findings. Yet, when it weighs her fate, the court returns to legal principles it has been forging all trial: intent, initiative, position in the chain of command, and contribution to the creation and maintenance of the criminal system. The male doctors form the system's skeleton. Oberhäuser is a muscle that moves it, but not the brain that conceived it. Here is where the gender question quietly enters without being named. In 1947, most judges, lawyers, and observers come from societies where female professionals are rare and women are stereotyped as less dangerous, less responsible actors. Oberhäuser, in that context, appears anomalous. A woman doctor in a black uniform accused of surgical torture. It is plausible that, at some level, decision-makers find it easier to understand her as a corrupted subordinate than as a full co-author of atrocity. The tribunal does not say this on the record. Sentencing is couched entirely in institutional terms. But when later historians and ethicists study the distribution of punishment, this possibility looms large. Was mercy shown because the evidence truly showed lesser guilt? Or because the image of a woman at the gallows was still, to that generation, almost unthinkable? At the same time, it would be too simple to reduce the outcome entirely to sexism. The tribunal applies similar logic to some male defendants who escape death. Junior camp doctors, lower-level administrators, and certain bureaucrats receive prison sentences or acquittals where the evidence shows compliance without evident initiative or enjoyment. The court is genuinely trying to model a scalable theory of responsibility. Execution is reserved for those whose decisions created the environment in which subordinates like Oberhäuser could act. That is why, in their reasoning, the 7 must die and the 1 woman can live. The judges want future courts to be able to distinguish between those who design crimes against humanity and those who merely enact them, however horrific those enactments are. Verdict day isn't just about legal theory, it is about human reactions. When the death sentences are read, some of the condemned stand rigid, others sag. Reports describe a mix of defiance and numbness. Brandt clings to the belief that history will vindicate him as a misunderstood reformer. Sievers tries to recast himself as a reluctant cog, a portrayal the tribunal has already rejected on the evidence. In the gallery, survivors and relatives of victims listen, many hoping that a rope will close a chapter that can never really close. When Oberhäuser's sentence is read, years of imprisonment instead of death, reactions split. Some Ravensbrück survivors are outraged. They later say that the woman whose hands held the scalpel should have shared the fate of her superiors. Others, wrestling with the same gradations the judges have just articulated, accept that her role, though monstrous, was not quite the same as those at the top. The immediate aftermath reveals how fragile legal lines are once politics and public opinion re-enter the picture. Within a few years, the Western occupation authorities begin commuting and reducing many Nuremberg sentences, including Oberhäuser's. As Cold War tensions rise, West German society prioritizes reintegration over continued punishment. Several of the male doctors originally sentenced to long imprisonment are released early. Oberhäuser, whose crimes were explicitly documented and whose victims are still alive to testify, walks out after serving only a fraction of her term. The same system that once declared her deeds crimes against humanity now allows her to resume a shadow of ordinary life. She even attempts to return to medical practice, a move that ignites public outrage when discovered. Here is where the decision to spare her from the gallows takes on a second, unintended meaning. For the judges, preserving her life was a way to affirm that law can distinguish degrees of guilt even in the blackest circumstances. For many of her former victims, her early release and attempt to resume treating patients feel like a betrayal. They see her lenient treatment in the 1950s as a symptom of a broader failure to fully confront Nazi-era crimes, especially when committed by those not at the very top. In this light, the initial refusal to hang her appears, to some, not as principled restraint, but as the first step on a slope toward forgetting. Yet the jurisprudence forged at Nuremberg, including in Oberhäuser's case, continues to shape how later tribunals approach nurses, orderlies, and lower-ranking professionals in genocides and mass atrocities. International courts in the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and elsewhere regularly cite the principle that individuals must be judged based on their specific roles, intent, and authority, not simply their membership in a criminal system. That is the long-term legacy of sparing a woman who caused immense suffering. Her case becomes the prototype for how to treat those who are clearly guilty, but not central planners. Before moving forward to the executions and the long-tail ethical debates this split sentence created, pause and think about the core question. If you were sitting on that bench in 1947 with the same documents, the same survivor testimony, and the same need to send a message to the world, would you have voted for death in all 8 cases? Or would you, like the tribunal, have tried to carve out a middle position between total vengeance and total forgiveness? That tension between justice and gradation lies at the heart of how the modern world thinks about war crimes. The gallows at Landsberg do not just end 7 lives. They crystallize a principle the tribunal has been building from the first day of the trial. Execution is reserved for those who turn their profession into an engine of systemic crime, not only for those whose hands are bloody. Brandt, Sievers, Murgowski, and their peers embody that judgment. They use their authority to bend institutions, ministries, research institutes, military medical services, toward the exploitation and destruction of human beings. Their signatures appear on policy documents, their words in lectures and memoranda encourage wider use of prisoners, and their careers rise on the arc of these projects. To the judges, this is what irreparable guilt looks like, a fusion of power, ideology, and initiative that makes life imprisonment seem too modest a response. This does not mean that the tribunal sees Oberheiser's actions as minor. On the contrary, in its written opinion, the court takes pains to describe the cruelty of her conduct. She did not simply hand instruments to male surgeons. She performed operations herself, cut into healthy limbs, introduced pathogens, and delivered lethal injections. The victim's testimonies, which the court accepts as credible, depict a doctor who at times seemed indifferent and even callous. What spares her is not a belief that she was compassionate, but a legal conclusion that she was replaceable in a way the 7 men were not. Another willing SS camp physician could have filled her slot. Very few could have stepped into Brandt's role as Hitler's plenipotentiary for health or Sievers' role as coordinator of the SS research complex. In legal terms, the tribunal is saying that the destruction of those 7 specific men is necessary to dismantle the idea that such power can ever again be wielded in such a way. Ending Oberheiser's life would add another corpse, but in their view, no additional deterrent value. The question of intent is equally central. For the male planners, intent is obvious. They speak in their own documents of utilizing prisoners for research, of taking advantage of the opportunity presented by concentration camps. They anticipate high mortality, request certain categories of prisoners, and show no sign of discomfort at the outcomes. Several express pride in their innovations, even when data is drawn from fatal experiments. Those records make it impossible for the tribunal to accept any claim that they were doing their best under difficult circumstances. For Oberheiser, intent is murkier. Her behavior is cruel. She clearly knows the victims did not consent. She sees them suffer and die. But there is less evidence that she was driven by ideology or career ambition to create and expand these experiments. The court concludes that her intent was that of a willing executor rather than a driving force. For a death sentence, they require more than that. There is also the special role of the medical profession itself. One reason the doctor's trial matters so much is that it forces judges to grapple with professionals who have a codified ethical duty to protect life. When soldiers violate the laws of war, their crimes are horrific, but they do not necessarily invert their professional identity. When doctors do, they destroy a moral trust that underpins all medicine. The tribunal returns to this theme repeatedly. It is one thing for a regime to build gas chambers. It is another for licensed physicians to run experiments on emaciated prisoners, pretending to practice science. Here, the symbolic weight of execution becomes part of the judgment. Executing leading doctors is a way for the international community to say, if you betray the core of your profession, the law will treat you as among the most dangerous criminals. Sparing Oberheiser, despite her involvement, acknowledges that not every doctor who violates ethics does so in the same way or at the same level. Now, zoom forward to the aftermath again, but this time follow Oberheiser, not the hanged men. Her prison term begins with the stigma of a high-profile conviction. Yet within a few years, political pressures for amnesty and sentence reduction change her reality. Review boards, influenced by the new West German government's desire to normalize relations and rebuild its medical system, reclassify many Nuremberg convicts, including her. Suddenly, a woman once labeled a war criminal for crimes against humanity walks out of prison. She attempts to resume medical work, first quietly, then more openly. It is only when former Ravensbrück prisoners and local activists uncover her past and publicize it that medical authorities move to revoke her license. This sequence reveals a stark gap between the symbolic severity of her original conviction and the practical leniency that followed. For the survivors, this is salt in an old wound. They had watched the tribunal carefully parse degrees of guilt, accepting the argument that the highest planners must pay with their lives, while someone like Oberheiser could be punished short of execution. Many had accepted that reasoning, if not happily, at least as part of a larger pattern of justice. To then see her released early and allowed to practice again feels like a breaking of an implicit promise that conviction at Nuremberg meant permanent exclusion from positions of trust. In their eyes, the nuance that separated her from the 7 hanged men has now mutated into a loophole that lets her slip back into society almost unscathed. The moral question shifts from, should she have been executed, to, what does it mean for a community to let her treat patients again? Looking at the longer arc of international law, Oberheiser's case continues to influence how courts and tribunals think about these dilemmas. Modern statutes for international criminal tribunals distinguish between principals and accessories, leaders and foot soldiers, much as the Nuremberg judges implicitly did. They create sentencing ranges that allow for life imprisonment, long terms, and sometimes the death penalty where it remains legal. Judges now routinely write detailed reasoning, explaining why one participant in a massacre receives a heavier sentence than another who was physically present but less central. While few of these later cases directly cite Oberheiser by name, they operate in a legal landscape shaped by her fate, the recognition that you can be deeply involved in atrocity and still be judged less than the worst, in a way that has life and death consequences. But this layered approach raises a haunting ethical question. When the system assigns a lesser sentence to someone like Oberheiser because she lacked the power and initiative of the 7 men, is it recognizing a real difference in responsibility, or is it inadvertently minimizing the suffering she personally caused? The women whose legs she mutilated do not experience their injuries as lesser harm because the orders came from above. Their pain is not diluted by the fact that she was not in the Reich Chancellery drafting directives. The law's rational calculus of ranks, roles, and intent can seem cold against the raw human reality of scars and nightmares. The doctor's trial thus leaves us with a permanent tension. Justice must be individualized to be fair. But individualization can feel like injustice to victims whose injuries are identical regardless of the perpetrator's position. Now, step outside the courtroom and into the broader cultural debate the case ignites. The image of 7 men on the gallows and 1 woman walking free of that specific fate becomes a touchstone for discussions of gender and punishment. Some commentators argue that the tribunal, and later the public, were too ready to see women as passive instruments, even when evidence showed active cruelty. They point to the relative scarcity of women prosecuted and sentenced severely for Nazi crimes compared to the number who served as guards, nurses, and administrators. In this view, Oberheiser's spared neck is emblematic of a broader pattern. Societies are uncomfortable seeing women as fully autonomous agents of evil and thus underpunish them. Others push back, noting that the majority of the worst planning roles in the Nazi state were, in fact, held by men, and that sentencing reflects structural realities more than stereotypes. That debate continues today in the context of other conflicts. Female guards in genocidal regimes, women who recruit child soldiers, nurses who participate in torture. These cases force courts and publics to confront whether their reactions differ based on gender. The logic the Nuremberg judges applied to Oberheiser, that her rank, not her sex, was decisive, offers a template. Focus on verified authority and intent, not assumptions about what men and women are like. Yet, it is naive to pretend that perceptions of gender never influence sentencing, sympathy, or outrage. The enduring interest in Oberheiser's story from historians, filmmakers, and ethicists suggests that her survival, in contrast to the 7 hanged men, still troubles our collective conscience. Bring this back to you, to the viewer watching this story unfold. The paradox that opened this video remains unresolved. 7 male doctors, all of them embedded in a murderous system, executed for their roles. 1 female doctor, deeply implicated but less central, spared. Was that a triumph of legal sophistication over blind revenge, or a sign that the court flinched when confronted with the idea of hanging a woman? If you believe in capital punishment for architects of atrocity, do you also believe it should apply to their assistants, regardless of gender and rank? Or do you think the line the tribunal drew, death for those at the top, imprisonment for those below, is the best compromise we can hope for in judging crimes on this scale? As you sit with those questions, remember that this is not an abstract puzzle. The way we answer them shapes how future war crimes trials are run, how doctors and nurses are trained to think about their responsibilities, and how societies decide who gets to rebuild their lives after participating in atrocity. If you've made it this far, let's keep the conversation going. In the comments, say whether you think the judges got it right with Oberheiser. Should she have stood on the same scaffold as the 7 men, or did sparing her reflect a necessary distinction in how law handles graded guilt? And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing. There are many more stories like this, where law, ethics, and history collide in uncomfortable ways that still matter today. It's early 1942, months before anyone imagines a doctor's trial. Ravensbrück is already a machine of cruelty. Barbed wire glistens with frost. A gray lake lies beyond the watchtowers. And inside the medical barracks, the air smells of carbolic acid and fear. Women in thin, striped dresses hobble along the roll call square. Some clutch at their thighs, bandages soaked through. In the infirmary, a young woman in a white coat moves briskly between beds. This is Herta Oberhäuser, newly installed camp physician. For many of the women here, she will be the only doctor they ever see. For some, her hands will be the last to touch them alive. Here's what you need to understand about this place before we go any further. Ravensbrück is not a regular camp hospital where doctors are overwhelmed and forced to make triage decisions in impossible conditions. It is a laboratory built on prisoners' bodies. Orders from Berlin, via Professor Gebhardt and his circle, have turned certain wards into experimental theaters. Lists arrive with names and numbers. SS medics escort selected women to surgery rooms, not to heal, but to be cut, infected, and observed. Oberhäuser stands at the intersection of two roles: nominal caregiver and instrument of experimentation. On one day, she might treat dysentery in a prisoner too valuable for labor to lose. On another, she will inject phenol into the heart of a woman marked as useless after an experiment has run its course. Witnesses later describe how the process works. Prisoners designated as rabbits, mostly young Polish resistors, are summoned without explanation. They are told they are going to the clinic for routine treatment or assignment to lighter work. Instead, they find themselves on operating tables. Some receive only local anesthesia. Others are conscious enough to feel the first cuts. Surgeons slash into muscles, crush bones with instruments, pack wounds with wood shavings or infected material. After the procedure, Oberhäuser checks their dressings, measures fevers, and notes reactions, not for the purpose of saving them, but to record how the artificially induced infections progress. In some cases, she offers injections for pain that, according to survivors, turn out to be lethal overdoses of oil or anesthetic. Legally, these details matter because they show how the line between healer and killer was erased step by step. Later, in Nuremberg, prosecutors bring these acts into focus as part of the larger pattern of Nazi medical crimes. But the law can only work with what it can prove. In Ravensbrück, as in Dachau, some procedures are logged meticulously, with dates, temperatures, and dosages. Others are done more informally, with fewer records. For the 7 male doctors who end up on the gallows list, there is an abundance of paperwork tying them to policy decisions, budgets, and broad experimental designs. For Oberhäuser, the evidence consists more of patient cards, witness testimony, and her own admissions than grand strategic memos. That asymmetry will later weigh heavily. Meanwhile, far from Ravensbrück, Allied intelligence units and war crimes investigators are beginning to piece together a picture of Nazi medical abuse. At first, they focus on the most visible atrocities: gas chambers, mass shootings, starvation. Only gradually do the stories of systematic experiments emerge through captured files and survivor interviews. When American teams enter the Dachau medical barracks and find detailed charts of hypothermia experiments, their understanding shifts. This is not just a story of sadistic guards. It is a story of doctors using all the tools of modern science, statistics, controls, standardized forms, to refine ways to inflict suffering and death. Ravensbrück's surgical logs, when they are finally recovered and translated, fit into this pattern. By mid-1946, as the main international military tribunal in Nuremberg wraps up, American prosecutors face a choice. They could try to handle the medical crimes as a footnote to the broader case against Nazi leadership, or they could devote an entire trial to what doctors and medical administrators did. They choose the latter. The reasons are both legal and symbolic. Legally, concentrating these cases allows them to build a focused narrative about medical ethics and human experimentation. Symbolically, it offers an opportunity to say that what happened in the camps is not simply war as usual, but a betrayal of one of humanity's most honored professions. That is how the doctor's trial is born, with 23 defendants chosen to represent different nodes in the system. When prosecutors select those 23, they include only one woman, and that alone tells you something about how they view the structure of Nazi medicine. Thousands of female nurses and some female doctors served in hospitals, camps, and killing centers, yet only Oberhäuser stands in the dock. She is there not because she is the most extreme example of female complicity, but because her work at Ravensbrück intersects with the male defendants' work at the highest levels. Her operations serve the research agenda of Gebhardt, who was closely tied to Himmler and to Brandt. Her presence allows prosecutors to show the full chain, from the ultimate policymakers to the professors, down to the camp-level practitioner whose scalpel cut flesh. In court, the prosecution deliberately juxtaposes scenes from Ravensbrück with those from other camps to show common patterns. Survivors describe cold water tanks in Dachau, high-altitude chambers, malaria infections, sterilization procedures. Then, Ravensbrück survivors take the stand and talk about their legs being sliced open, bones scraped, infections induced. The details differ, but the structure is the same. Non-consensual experiments with no therapeutic aim, conducted on prisoners chosen precisely because they had no power to refuse. When the judges later explain why they see these acts as war crimes and crimes against humanity, they emphasize this structural pattern. It is not the location or the specific technique that makes an experiment criminal. It is the combination of coercion, lack of therapeutic purpose, and disregard for suffering. The defense teams, for both the male doctors and for Oberheiser, attempt to break this pattern down into isolated incidents. They argue that some experiments were legitimate research that unfortunately led to deaths, that others were emergency medical procedures misinterpreted by traumatized witnesses, and that still others were personal excesses not representative of policy. For Oberheiser, the argument is that she was trying, within an impossible environment, to care for patients as best she could while following orders from superiors she could not disobey. But the accumulation of documents and testimonies overwhelms these efforts. The judges see too many repeated similar stories from too many different camps to accept that this was anything other than an integrated system. Here's where the legal concept of command responsibility comes in. At Nuremberg, and later in many other tribunals, this idea becomes central. Leaders can be held responsible not only for what they personally do, but for what they order, encourage, or knowingly allow to happen under their authority. For the 7 men eventually hanged, the evidence shows clear command responsibility. Brandt, as Hitler's Special Commissioner for Health, signs off on broad experimental programs. Handloser supervises military doctors who run experiments on prisoners. Sievers coordinates the SS research office that funnels data and specimens to and from camps. Rogowski provides the technical expertise and materials that make lethal experiments possible. Their command roles make them more culpable in the eyes of the tribunal than those who merely implement. Oberheiser, by contrast, does not fit neatly into this command responsibility framework. She supervises nurses and has authority over parts of the Ravensbrück infirmary, but she does not direct the overall experimental agenda. She cannot order new experiments on her own. In the tribunal's reasoning, that difference in position transforms her from a principal into an accessory. In many legal systems, accessories can be punished just as severely as principals, including with death. But here, the judges choose to use that distinction as a sentencing tool. Accessories can receive long prison terms while principals face the gallows. Oberheiser's survival thus becomes a practical demonstration of a conceptual line the court is trying to draw. If you step back, you can see how fragile and contestable this line is. A survivor whose leg was mutilated by Oberheiser's scalpel might reasonably feel that the person wielding the instrument bears as much responsibility as the person who approved the overall program. A legal scholar might respond that without people like Brandt and Gebhardt at the top, there would have been no Ravensbrück experiments at all, and someone like Oberheiser would never have been in that position. The tribunal's solution is to accept that both views have truth. It treats those at the top as irreplaceable architects whose removal by death is necessary to send a message and prevent recurrence. It treats those below, including Oberheiser, as morally compromised but not beyond the reach of non-lethal punishment. In a sense, the entire debate about Oberheiser's sentence boils down to how we think about systems versus individuals. If you believe systems are everything, that it is the structure of Nazi medicine, not the particular personalities, that made these crimes possible, you might consider the distinction between planners and executors superficial. If you believe individuals matter, that certain people actively created and drove the system, you might see a real moral and legal difference between those who envisioned and ordered the crimes and those who took part without shaping the overall design. Nuremberg's answer, embodied in the 7 ropes and 1 spared neck, leans toward the latter view. Before we move into the long-tail legacy, how Oberheiser's case influenced modern codes of medical ethics and current debates about gender and punishment, consider how you, yourself, would draw the line. If you were constructing a legal system to respond to atrocities, would you treat planners and executors identically? Would you always reserve death for those at the very top? Or would you be willing to impose it on those who physically performed the worst acts regardless of rank? And does the fact that Oberheiser was a woman change your answer? Or should it be irrelevant? The noose that never tightens around Hertha Oberheiser's neck is in many ways woven from paper, indictments, affidavits, trial transcripts, and a final judgment that chooses imprisonment over execution for her while condemning 7 other defendants to death. Those 7, Karl Brandt, Waldemar Hoven, Joachim Rogowski, Wolfram Sievers, Victor Brack, Rudolf Brandt, and Karl Gebhardt, are singled out in the verdict as bearing primary responsibility for a system of killing and experimentation, and they are hanged at Landsberg prison on June 2nd, 1948. Oberheiser, by contrast, is sentenced on August 20th, 1947 to 20 years imprisonment for her role in war crimes and crimes against humanity later commuted to 10, and in practice, she serves only about 5 before walking free and even briefly returning to medical practice. Understanding why requires looking closely at the tribunal's own reasoning and at how it weighed her authority, initiative, and intent against theirs. The judges begin with the basic facts of her case. In their judgment, they find that Oberheiser volunteered to serve as a camp doctor in the women's department at Ravensbrück around 1940 and remained there until mid-1943, directly assisting Karl Gebhardt's program of sulfanilamide and bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration experiments on prisoners. They accept evidence that she helped select women for these surgeries, participated in operations that mutilated healthy limbs to simulate battlefield wounds, and injected substances, including oil and poison, that led to prolonged agony and death. At the same time, they note that the prosecution dropped an initial allegation connecting her to certain sterilization experiments, and they find no proof that she conceived or ordered the overall Ravensbrück research agenda herself. She is guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, but in the court's view, she is an executor of a program designed and driven by others, Gebhardt, Murgowski, Brandt, rather than one of its architects. For the 7 men condemned to hang, the documentary record looks very different. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician and Reich Commissioner for Health and Sanitation, stands at the apex of the euthanasia program and is found to have authorized and overseen killings of the disabled in experimental projects that flowed directly from that policy. Murgowski, as chief hygienist of the SS, organizes typhus, phenol injection, and other lethal experiments and supplies the technical infrastructure and agents that make them possible across multiple camps. Sievers manages the Ahnenerbe, the SS Research Society that coordinates and funds a range of camp experiments, including bone and muscle work at Ravensbrück and skeleton collections at other sites. Hoven is condemned as Buchenwald's chief doctor, convicted of using phenol injections and participating in medical killings in a way that fuses camp terror with clinical technique. Victor Brack and Rudolf Brandt are not physicians, but as high-level administrators, they are found to have arranged transports, paperwork, and logistical support that make mass murder and experimentation possible. Gebhardt, tried in absentia in some accounts of the doctor's trial, but executed after a separate process, is described as the driving surgical mind behind the Ravensbrück bone and sulfanilamide operations that entangled Oberheiser. The tribunal's explanation for imposing death on those 7 but not on Oberheiser turns on 3 interlocking ideas: command responsibility, degree of initiative, and the symbolic role of exemplary punishment. First, command responsibility. The court holds that leaders who design, authorize, and extend criminal programs are more culpable than those who operate within a framework they did not create. Brandt, Murgowski, Sievers, Brack, Rudolf Brandt, Hoven, and Gebhardt are all tied by their own signatures and correspondence to high-level decisions. They request camps for research, allocate prisoners for use as material, channel funds, and choose projects knowing that non-consensual experiments and deaths will follow. By contrast, while Oberheiser clearly exercises local authority in the Ravensbrück infirmary and over nurses, the judgment finds no evidence that she herself decided that these experiments should be carried out, or that she had the power to launch or stop them at policy level. In other words, she is deeply involved in implementation, but the court does not place her in the same category of system makers. Second, the judges focus on initiative and zeal. In documents and testimony, several of the condemned men appear as active promoters of the experiments. They petition Himmler or other superiors for approval, propose new fields of inquiry, and boast about their results at conferences and in reports, indicating that they see the camp system as an opportunity for research that could advance their reputations. The tribunal cites this fanatical devotion and eagerness as aggravating factors. These defendants are not merely obeying, they are innovating in cruelty. Oberheiser's statements, preserved in the record, strike a different tone. In her final words to the court, she insists that, as a woman in a difficult position, I did the best I could in providing what she describes as therapeutic care, aligning herself with her defense counsel's portrayal of a subordinate doctor under pressure. The judges reject her claim of innocence, but implicitly accept that her role was more that of a willing assistant than a prime mover, and they treat that lesser initiative as grounds to avoid the gallows. Third, the tribunal consciously uses the death sentences to send a wider message about medicine and the state. Contemporary accounts from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and legal historians emphasize that the doctor's trial is intended to do more than punish. It aims to articulate norms that will govern human experimentation and professional ethics going forward. Executing the most prominent figures dramatizes the idea that turning medicine into an instrument of state killing is among the gravest of crimes. The Nuremberg Code, formulated in the judgment's wake, opens with the principle that the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. A direct response to the involuntary experiments at Dachau, Ravensbrück, Buchenwald, and elsewhere. In that moral theater, the seven hanged doctors embody the complete inversion of medical duty. Oberheiser, though condemned, is presented as someone whose removal from society via long-term imprisonment is sufficient to protect the public and mark her guilt without requiring the symbolic finality of execution. Gender shadows all of this, even where the judgment does not speak of it directly. Oberheiser is the only woman in the dock and the only female physician tried at Nuremberg, despite the wider participation of women as nurses and guards in the camp system. Her own statement to the court leans on being a woman in a difficult position, suggesting a defense strategy that subtly invokes early post-war expectations about female subordination. Later, scholarship and educational materials note that she volunteered for the Ravensbrück position and pursued her medical career energetically, complicating any simple picture of her as a passive tool. Still, historians have asked whether unconscious bias made it harder for judges and observers in the 1940s to imagine a woman as a mastermind deserving of the gallows, even when evidence showed agency and cruelty. The tribunal's written reasoning remains framed in terms of rank and function, but the fact that the only woman in the case receives a non-capital sentence while 7 men die has become a focal point in debates about gender and accountability. The story does not end with the sentencing. Archival sources show that Oberheiser's 20-year sentence is reduced on review to 10 years in 1951, and she is released in April 1952 for exemplary behavior, so after serving about 5 years. She is officially classified as a late returnee and opens a medical practice in the village of Stocksee, Schleswig-Holstein, treating private patients. Only when former Ravensbrück prisoners and journalists expose her identity does public pressure lead to disciplinary proceedings. In 1958, a West German medical court finally revokes her license permanently, but she lives the rest of her life as a free woman, dying in 1978. By contrast, the 7 hanged doctors have no second acts. Their names become shorthand in legal and ethical literature for the most extreme form of professional betrayal and for the category of crimes that justify capital punishment in international law. That contrast between the finality of the gallows and the reversibility of a prison term has shaped how survivors, scholars, and ethicists judge the tribunal's choices. Some Ravensbrück survivors and later commentators argue that sparing Oberheiser and allowing her release so soon undermined the moral clarity of the doctor's trial, signaling that those who physically mutilated and killed prisoners could, in practice, escape with relatively light consequences if they occupied lower ranks or fit certain social expectations. Others defend the distinction, pointing out that Nuremberg's broader legacy lies in its insistence on graded responsibility. Not everyone in a criminal system is equally guilty, and the law must distinguish between leaders, key organizers, and those who merely participate, however horrifically. In this view, executing only the 7 most responsible doctors while imprisoning others, including Oberheiser, reflects a deliberate attempt to balance retribution with fairness. The ethical questions raised by this split still resonate in modern debates about war crimes, especially when it comes to professionals like doctors, lawyers, and engineers who help make atrocities possible. International tribunals today rarely use the death penalty, but they still wrestle with how to calibrate sentences. How many years should a camp doctor, a nurse who administered lethal injections, or a bureaucrat who scheduled deportation trains receive compared to the ministers and generals above them? Oberheiser's case is frequently cited in discussions of whether mitigating factors such as rank, gendered social expectations, and claims of difficult position should significantly reduce punishment when the underlying acts are undeniably brutal. It also feeds into ongoing conversations about whether post-conflict societies do enough to prevent those convicted of serious abuses from returning to positions of trust, especially in fields like medicine. In the end, the paradox that opened the story remains deliberately unresolved. 7 men, Brandt, Hoven, Rogowski, Sievers, Brack, Rudolf Brandt, and Gebhardt, are hanged as the ultimate symbols of medicine turned murderous, while the only woman to stand trial alongside them, Herta Oberheiser, lives out 3 more decades after a comparatively brief imprisonment. The judges at Nuremberg believed they were drawing a necessary line between the irredeemable architects of atrocity and those whose guilt, though grave, did not require death. Whether that line was drawn in the right place, and whether gender subtly shifted it, is a question that each generation has to answer for itself. So now it's your turn. Given what you've heard, do you think Oberheiser should have joined those 7 men on the scaffold, or was the tribunal right to treat her differently because of her rank and role? Should law always recognize gradations of guilt in systems of mass crime, or does doing so risk excusing too much? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you value deep, document-based dives into cases like this, where law, ethics, and history collide, consider subscribing and liking this video so more people can join this conversation.